right, good afternoon, everyone. First, I just wanted to thank you all for being here, and then I also wanted to echo Melody in thanking everyone at the Berkeley Center, the CSJ, and as well as my hosts at the Ukrainian Catholic University for such an enriching and powerful project this summer. All right, so like Melody said, this summer I was in Lviv, Ukraine, which is in the western part of Ukraine. So I was doing my research at the Ukrainian Catholic University. So a little bit of background about the Ukrainian Catholic University. It has existed in some iterations since 1928, although its official founding date isn't until 2002. So it was founded originally as the Greek Catholic Theological Academy in 1928, but it was closed by the Soviet government in 1944. Many of the clergymen who had worked there went underground fearing repression, but others went abroad and continued the work they'd been doing at the academy, particularly in Rome, where they opened the Ukrainian Catholic University of Pope Clement I in 1963. In 1994, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Lviv Theological Academy was reopened, and in 2002, it was renamed the Ukrainian Catholic University, becoming the first Catholic university on the territory of the former Soviet Union. So in formulating the guiding questions for this project, one of the challenges of working in a post-Soviet context was unearthing a culturally appropriate understanding of how Ukrainians define social justice, given that the language of social justice as it exists in the West is not always comfortable for Ukrainians. And additionally, another challenge was framing how the Ukrainian Catholic University enacts its own vision of social justice, given that it is not actually a Jesuit institution, but rather an institution in the Eastern Christian tradition, which tends to be a little bit more conservative, and given that the term social justice is not necessarily part of the university's jargon. However, the two questions that I landed on were, one, how is social justice defined in Ukraine? And two, how does the Ukrainian Catholic University enact a vision of social justice? So in terms of defining social justice in Ukraine, you can see kind of three different categories that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but these are how participants tended to define social justice. So there are some quotes here that sort of demonstrate that. So the first was access. So by that, participants tended to mean access to shared goods, access to public life and services, such as education, healthcare, pensions, etc. Another was dignity. So the language of dignity has become particularly present in Ukraine and in the interviews, given the Euromaidan protests, which happened a few years ago, and that was considered a revolution of dignity in Ukraine. So many participants spoke in more theoretical terms, describing a society in which individuals are treated with respect, and really their full humanity is respected. And then the last way that people tended to define social justice was self-realization. So by that, participants meant the ability for individuals to have agency over their own lives, to accomplish the things they want to accomplish for themselves and their families. So in terms of what the Ukrainian Catholic University actually does to enact a vision of justice, there are sort of three main ways that are both present and future-oriented that they do. So the first is providing a quality education. So a lot of the participants identified three really big gaps in Ukraine's system of higher education. The first being corruption, so students paying bribes for better grades or the outright buying of diplomas from different private universities. They also identified an emphasis on theoretical over practical education, so students felt unprepared for the real world by the time they graduated. And then also they identified a lack of innovation, so they felt like they were being taught things that were outdated, that weren't useful for them anymore, and that they weren't, again, being prepared for the future. So by working to overcome those gaps, the Ukrainian Catholic University is working towards social justice in the short term by providing a quality education to students in Ukraine. And then two kind of more future-oriented or kind of bigger picture ways that the Ukrainian Catholic University enacts a vision of social justice is first by modeling just processes. So the Ukrainian Catholic University markets itself as the only university in Ukraine that is not corrupt. So by making their financial records open and acting to ensure that their honor code is totally upheld, the Ukrainian Catholic University is really striving to live up to its reputation as the only not corrupt university in Ukraine. And in doing so, it is serving as a model for other institutions in Ukraine who see that success does not have to come at the price of integrity. And that, in fact, part of why the Ukrainian Catholic University is so successful is because of its high standards, which tend to attract donors and tend to attract international attention that is positive versus negative. And then the last way that UKU models a vision of social justice is by working to instill values. So one of the participants that I interviewed had a really moving quote where he said, "We are not just concerned with students' professional development. For us, it is important to shape students as good citizens, as good Christians, and as good people. This formation of students with an education grounded in values is very important." So at the Ukrainian Catholic University, the students and the administrators and professors all have this notion that they are really forming themselves and forming individuals who will shape the country's future. So quality education is key to a more just society because education provides the access to the information, the skills, and the development of critical thought that allows individuals to see themselves as informed, empowered actors within their own social and political system. And then that, combined with the Ukrainian Catholic University's emphasis on morality and Christian values, promotes a unique environment for the formation of community leaders, public servants, and professionals who advance social justice and help to ingrain notions of justice in the very institutional fabric of the organizations of which they are a part or of which they will become. So in terms of kind of bridging the two research questions, there's actually a very close correlation in terms of between the notions of social justice as defined by those interviewed and then the mechanisms by which the Ukrainian Catholic University is working to promote social justice. So first we see social justice defined as access tends to be reflected in students' access to quality education. Social justice defined as dignity is reflected in the fair and transparent nature of the Ukrainian Catholic University, which respects individuals and promotes equity. And then finally, social justice defined as self-realization is reflected in the empowerment of students who are encouraged to use their talents to advance the common good and in doing so to live lives of greater purpose. So just to give a little bit of some pictures and to reflect a little bit personally on the experience, this summer project was really moving for me because my own parents are from Ukraine, so I grew up speaking Ukrainian. Most of my family still lives there. So it was a really unique opportunity to connect with my roots, but in a very kind of personal way because I wasn't there with my parents or my family. I was really seeing Ukraine for myself and with my own eyes, my own experiences. So I was actually able to travel quite a bit. So here are some of the pictures of honestly some of the most beautiful and idyllic places I've ever been. So small villages in the western part of the country, as well as the Carpathian Mountains, some really historic churches in smaller cities, the architecture in Lviv, which is this beautiful old city. And despite all of that beauty, there's still a lot of reminders of the difficult place that Ukraine is in right now in its history. So this is some graffiti that I saw in Lviv, and this is commemorating a fight in the eastern part of Ukraine where there's currently an unofficial war going on between unidentified but really Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers. And this is an airport in that region that ended up being a site of a huge kind of battle between these two groups. So there's kind of this graffiti and there's this memory all over Ukraine of what is going on now. However, I definitely came out of this project with a different perspective on Ukraine than before. I thought that I knew what a lot of the answers I was going to get were going to be, and that's not necessarily the case. And the answers from participants that I got ended up being so nuanced and not easily reducible. They just ended up really opening my eyes to how much Ukrainians understand their own system and understand the challenges that they are going to face in the future, and as well as the challenges that they're facing now. So this project really challenged me to see Ukraine in a less reductionistic way and to critically engage with the narratives I had heard in the past and what I was seeing and experiencing for myself. So having gone when I did, I think I was able to get an insight into the country and the culture at a truly historic moment, a moment in which Ukraine really is at a crossroads. And in being at the Ukrainian Catholic University and seeing the amazing work of the people there, I can say very confidently that the Ukrainian Catholic University stands positioned to move Ukraine towards that brighter future.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. She has to go to class. We have a few minutes. If anyone has questions you'd like to ask her about her project, her research, what it's like to be an ESJ fellow, the floor is open. If you can stand up and...
Oh, contact information.
Oh, contact information. For her? Yeah, I can share that. Yeah, see me after. If you
Yeah,
agree.
no, it's totally fine. Absolutely.
That sounds good.
Yeah, Amanda.
Does the university receive government funding, and how does that dedication to non-corrupt practices and being really transparent
Yeah, it's actually a really important question because funding is a pretty controversial topic in terms of higher education in Ukraine. So, private universities, for the most part, are actually seen as being worse because they tend to be kind of someone's pocket. They're very often kind of fronts for businessmen who want to launder money, or a lot of times, like, they're set up essentially as businesses so people can kind of buy diplomas from them without actually doing any of the work. Whereas public universities in Ukraine tend to be considered better, but also have to go through this really tooth and nail fight to get the funding that they want. So there is a bit of other universities in Ukraine look at the Ukrainian Catholic University almost with a little bit of envy because they see how much funding this university is getting, especially from abroad, from Ukrainians who are living abroad. But again, a really big part of the success of the Ukrainian Catholic University is that commitment to integrity, because when people look at this university and they see how transparent it is, they're more willing to donate money if they know where it's going and if it's going towards this really this bigger mission of common good versus donating to a different university who knows where that money might go, or a different organization who, again, because of the corruption, who knows. So funding is really an important topic, and it bears stressing how unique the Ukrainian Catholic University is because it is one of only 2 religious universities. So like religious higher education in Ukraine is not common at all. So the Ukrainian Catholic University is really kind of like a forerunner of potentially the future.
Any other questions?
How did you figure out what jargon to use? Like, in terms of figuring out what Ukrainian terms to use,
Mhm.
was there an existing source on social media, regular media? How did you figure out how to ask the questions you were getting at with jargon involved?
Yeah, so to be perfectly honest, at first I just sort of did my best with the Ukrainian that I had, kind of translating very literally social justice. And actually, a lot of times when I'd be interviewing someone and I'd ask them, using the term that I was using, they would kind of pause and they would say, "Oh, do you mean like social equality, or do you mean like they would kind of substitute other phrases that were more familiar to them over social justice." And in doing that, that actually ended up being really enlightening for me because I was able to see what terms were they using and how did that actually differ from the idea of social justice that I was really trying to get at, and like the definition that I was trying to get them to critically engage with. So a lot of it also has to do with, again, the state that Ukraine is in right now with the protests at the Maidan a couple of years ago. So with that, again, the revolution of dignity, the language of human rights, the language of dignity has become much more common in Ukraine. And having gone this past summer, it was 4 years after the last time I had gone, and just seeing how different the discourse was between people and kind of how much higher minded a lot of the concerns that especially students tended to have were was really powerful. So yeah, it was definitely a little bit tricky to get at the language specifically, but I think kind of again talking around it a little bit and explaining helped me sort of hone in on what was a culturally appropriate definition of social justice.
Great. Thank you, Anastasia. Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating in your report. She talks about that in detail, the language we use, how she had to wrestle with what definition of social justice means to us in a different cultural context. And she did a really good job in Ukrainian doing these interviews, translating, transcribing, and publishing them. So